Mr. Stanley's Trojans. Derek and Janie were eating school lunch in the dining hall and talking about Mr. Stanley's trousers. Mr. Stanley was their teacher and he wore the same trousers to school every day. Mr. Stanley's trousers are so big and messy, said Janie. And dirty, said Derek. They look like an old tablecloth, said Janie. And he wears them all the time, agreed Derek. Hasn't he got any other trousers? Said Janie. We should call him old tablecloth trousers, added Derek, sticking his fork into his food. Why doesn't he buy some new ones? Asked Janie. At the moment, old tablecloth trousers came into the dining hall. Janie's mouth fell open and Derek could see the food in her mouth. What's wrong? He asked. Janie looked and pointed. Mr. Stanley was wearing a new suit. It was a beautiful white suit without any marks. Everyone in the dining hall stopped eating and looked at him. Carry on, everyone, said Mr. Stanley. His face was a little red. Carry on eating. Wow, said Derek, leaning across the table. He looks so different. He looks smart too, said Janie. Later that afternoon, Janie's class went into the sports hall for PE. Mr. Stanley was already there waiting for them. I like your shirt, Mr. Stanley, Janie told him. Thank you, Janie. It's for parents' evening, he replied. Parents' evening? Asked Janie. Yes, I have to look my best for the parents' evening, said Mr. Stanley. But that's on Monday. Today is only Friday, Mr. Stanley, Derek said. I know, Derek. I'm wearing it today, so it won't look too new on Monday. While they were talking, Mrs. Cook came out of the kitchen with a bowl of jelly in her hands. She saw Mr. Stanley in the sports hall. She was very surprised to see him in his bright new suit. Oh, she shouted. She grabbed one of the curtains to stop herself falling. The jelly went into the air. Derek saw it coming and stepped in front of Mr. Stanley. The jelly flew through the air and landed on Derek's vest. Everyone was silent. Derek stood there looking sad and yellow. He was covered in cold jelly. Well done, Derek, said Mr. Stanley. You saved my new suit. Derek tried to smile, but the jelly was going into his shorts. After the break, Mr. Stanley changed it back into his old tablecloth trousers. Please don't touch it, he said, hanging his new suit on the cupboard door in the classroom. Don't go near it. The last lessons of the day was art. Mr. Stanley was teaching Derek and Janie's class. They had to paint interesting faces. Janie was painting a monster. She painted red around his eyes, a large screw through his neck, and green things coming out of his nose. She was pleased with the green things, but she still had a lot of green paint. Do you want some green paint? Do you want some green paint? She asked Derek. I don't need any green paint, Janie, he said. I'm painting a footballer. You can paint green things coming out of your footballer nose, she said. No, said Derek. I don't want to. You can paint the background green like grass, said Janie. I don't want my footballer running around on green things from a monster's nose. Thank you, said Derek. He knocked Janie's elbow carelessly, and the green paint spilled over the desk. Derek tried to stop the paint running onto the floor with his hands. His hands were dirty, so he rubbed them on a towel behind him. However, it was not a towel. Oh, he said quietly, it's not a tower. Janie looked at Derek and shouted, Oh no, Derek! You've cleaned your hands on Mr. Stanley's new trousers. You'll be in trouble, she said. Oh, the tablecloth trousers will be really angry when he sees them. Mr. Stanley was on the other side of the room. He looked up and smiled at him. Are you two okay? He asked. Yes, thank you, Mr. Stanley, Janie said happily. She could not tell him the truth. She got some paper and started to rub the green marks on Mr. Stanley's trousers. You fool, said Derek. You're making the marks worse. They're twice as big now. The marks were very big. Janie looked at Derek and thought. There's only one thing to do, she said. What's that? Asked Derek. Put the trousers back under the jacket, then we can clean them after school, said Janie. When Mr. Stanley came over to look at their pictures, the chute was still swinging slightly on the cupboard door. Oh, he said, I love the color, Janie. That's a lovely green color. When it was time to go home, Mr. Stanley stayed in the classroom for a long time. Derek and Janie wanted him to leave, but he did not. They collected the chairs as slowly as they could. Then, at last, Mr. Stanley went to the teacher's room. Derek ran to the sink and turned on the taps. Janie got the trousers and threw them across the room to him. Derek caught them and threw them into the sink. He took a plastic bottle and squeezed some liquid on the trousers. What are you doing? Shouted Janie. I'm using washing up liquid, said Derek. This will clean them. That's not washing up liquid, Derek. That's a glue, shouted Janie. Suddenly, they heard Mr. Stanley outside the door. He was wearing his jacket and was ready to ride his bicycle home. Derek and Janie stood side by side in front of the sink. Oh, said Mr. Stanley, are you still here? We're nearly finished, Mr. Stanley, said Janie, trying to smile. It looks tidy to me. Go home now, said Mr. Stanley. He went over to the jacket on the cupboard door. Don't, said Derek. Don't what? asked Mr. Stanley. Don't take the chute, said Derek. Why not? asked Mr. Stanley. Because, said Derek. Because you might make it, Derek, Janie said. It'll be safer if you leave it here. Derek nodded. Yes, he said quietly. Mr. Stanley did not understand. He put his hand on his jacket. It might fall off your bicycle, Janie added, and land on some rubbish or something. Mr. Stanley took his hand off his jacket. Yes, you're right, he said. I don't want to have an accident. As soon as Mr. Stanley walked out of the classroom, Janie and Derek put the trousers in a plastic bag. Then they took them to Derek's house. They threw the trousers in the kitchen sink and covered them with hot water and washing powder. They cleaned them with a strong brush and a bar of soap. They made a lot of bubbles. Are they clean now? asked Janie. Derek moved the bubbles out of the way and looked into the sink. No, they're still green, he said. They put washing up liquid, polish, and floor cleaner in the sink, but the trousers were still dirty. Perhaps we should throw them around like a washing machine, said Derek. So they ran outside and hit the trousers against the ground in Derek's garden. However, the trousers just got dirtier. There's only one thing to do, said Janie. What's that? asked Derek. We'll have to take the trousers to the dry cleaners, she replied. The next day was a Saturday. Derek and Janie rolled up the trousers and put them in a plastic bag. They took the first bus into town. They put the plastic bag on the seat between them. Janie did not want to look at them. They waited until the dry cleaners was empty and then walked in. Janie smiled at the woman and the woman smiled back. The trousers, Derek, said Janie. Yes, the trousers, said Derek. Give them to me, said Janie. I can't, said Derek. Why not? asked Janie. Because you've got them, said Derek. No, I haven't. You have, said Janie. For a moment they stood there and looked at each other. Then Derek said in a quiet voice, Janie, the trousers are still on the bus. 3 hours later, they arrived at the bus station. They were very tired. They walked up and down until they saw their bus. It was in a corner. They saw 2 feet sticking out under the bus. Excuse me, Janie said to the feet. We left something on your bus this morning. The feet came out and a man stood up. He cleaned his hands on a dirty old cloth. What did you leave on the bus? He asked. A pair of trousers, said Derek. No, I haven't seen any trousers on this bus, said the man. Only the ones people were wearing. He shook his head and threw the dirty old clothes in a box. It flew through the air and Janie saw a trouser leg. It was a trouser leg with green marks on it. There they are, she shouted. There are Mr. Stanley's trousers. Really? said the man. Isn't it just a dirty old clothes? Derek took the trousers out of the box using a stick. He held them up and looked at them carefully. Oh no, he said. They're worse than before. Janie looked at them. There's only one thing to do, she said. What's that? asked Derek. We'll have to tell Mr. Stanley the truth, replied Janie. On Monday, Derek and Janie got to school early. They went into the classroom and took the trousers out of the bag. They saw the oil from the bus and the dirt from Derek's garden. They saw the glue and the green paint. They looked at each other. We have to do it, said Janie. We have to tell the truth. Then they put the trousers back under the jacket and went to look for Mr. Stanley. They found him in the sports hall. Janie, Derek, said Mr. Stanley with a smile. What's the matter? It's your shoot, Mr. Stanley, said Janie bravely. We've got something to tell you. However, before Janie could say another word, Mrs. Cook ran into the hall and grabbed Mr. Stanley's arm. Chips! Chips! She screamed. No, thank you, Mrs. Cook, said Mr. Stanley. It's too early in the morning to eat chips. No, Mr. Stanley, the chips in the kitchen. There's on fire, shouted Mrs. Cook. What? asked Mr. Stanley. Mr. Stanley ran to the kitchen doors and pushed them open. A cloud of black smoke came into the hall. Oh, no, he said, and ran back into the sports hall again. Throw some water on the fire, Mr. Stanley, shouted Derek. Water's no good, said Mr. Stanley. Water will make it worse. I need a cloth or something to cover the fire. Then he saw the shoot hanging from Janie's finger. There's only one thing to do, Mr. Stanley, said Janie, and Mr. Stanley quickly took the chute. He threw the chute on the fire. Of course, the chute burnt. It became a mess of smoke and oil. Janie tried to tell Mr. Stanley about his trousers, but Mr. Stanley did not really listen. Never mind, he said. Never mind about my trousers. Mr. Stanley became the star of the school, so he was very pleased with himself. The head administrator promised to buy Mr. Stanley a new suit, and he was pleased with that too. Good, said Mr. Stanley. I can a nice bright white one. Oh, don't do that, said Janie quickly. Why not? asked Mr. Stanley. Well, green is better color for you, said Janie. Yes, said Derek. Green's a lovely color. The end.